When I was in high school in Nepean by the Sports Blacks, Confed. Yay, Confed. I went to high school with one black boy, Ricky Coker, and he was the life of the school, really popular, a jokester. And I never really thought about it till after high school, what it must have been like for him to have gone to school with only white kids. It's one of the chapters you talk about is race, and I think your chapter is pretty brave because you talk about bigotry, and it was pretty rampant in your own family, especially in today's climate. But it was also one of the chapters that garnered the most reaction from citizen readers, and we had a lot of letters, people thinking that was very brave of you to tackle that subject. And what sort of feedback have you received?
Nobody complained, and I was so pleased about that, because it can be such a touchy subject. But the kind of racial hatred that you get to talk about if you're a person of my generation isn't the same now, because, well, let me read it to you. In the Ottawa of my youth, some 65 years ago or more, I remember only two black people. There was Mr. Barber, who had a magazine and newspaper stall on the corner of Bank and Queen Streets, and a girl named Lana, who went to York Street School with us in Lowertown. There may have been others, but I never encountered them. We paid, as I recall, little or no attention to the color of the skins of Mr. Barber and Lana, other than Lana was quite a bit darker than Mr. Barber for some reason. I don't recall the notions of race or racial tolerance or racial discrimination or racial differences or racial equality ever brought up at home or at school or at church. Race as a subject was just not out there. Race was not a word we ever heard used. You were just simply brought up to despise certain people. On my street, it was generally assumed that you didn't like Jews, frogs, Protestants, or anybody with the slightest trace of a British accent. We were never once instructed not to like Jews, for instance, who seemed to be on the top of everybody's list. The feeling was just there, as natural and unquestioned and everyday and expected and taken for granted as breathing. We didn't know, of course, at that exact moment in human history, the most horrific pogrom of all time was systematically being carried out across Europe. I do recall from time to time wondering why it was that my French-Canadian enemies were much more enthusiastic about hating the Jews than we Irish Catholics were. It dawned on me much later that the reason for this was Irish Catholics were also a persecuted minority, albeit several notches above the Jews when it came to suffering. Other races felt our childish disdain. The Chinese, for instance, were always good for a few laughs. Some of our wittier moments were spent outside Chinese laundries, making faces like Charlie Chan and saying, "Ah, so." Very funny. That lasted, I'm ashamed to say, well into senior high school, where we distinguished ourselves as wits at Chinese restaurants, aping the waiters and throwing food around. This came to an abrupt and shocking end one day when an insider who had worked in the kitchens told us that often the offended waiter would take a piss in the mockers' soup. Just before serving it steaming hot. We were taught to disdain the French Canadians among us. Like all young racists, of course, we never knew why this was. Our teachers told us the French lost the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759. Could that have been it? I don't think so. Was it our language difference? My Scottish grandmother used to like saying that the English never learned to speak French in 1066 when the Normans tried to force them to, so why should we start now? We used to mock how the French tried to speak English. Was that why we didn't try French? Afraid of the mockery? As for the Protestants, well, in my narrow Irish Catholic peasant worldview, they were just going straight to hell, and that was that. This attitude came down to me through my father's side of the family, the farmers along the Gatineau River. The very definition of hell involved the various positions in which Protestants were placed down there by the grace of our loving Lord God Almighty and his beloved Son, Jesus Christ. And that'll learn the bastards. Some were hung by the ankles by long chains and periodically dipped in vats of simmering pus, then lifted out to dry off, only to be dipped again, and on through eternity. Others were thrust stark naked into dead spruce trees, where they were forever lunched upon by swarms of starving black flies. One of my favorites was the Protestant who was left standing on an electric stove hot plate. The idea came to us after one of our annual visits to the Midway at the Ottawa exhibition in August. In a booth, they had a glass cage containing a live chicken. The floor of this chicken's little room was a metal hot plate. You put your dime in, and the booth would come alive with flashing lights and Mexican dance music. And your dime heated the floor so that the chicken was standing on one foot and then on another foot and then on the other foot, faster and faster as the heat built up. Chico the Dancing Mexican Chicken was the name of the act. Now, there was a position your Protestant would surely wind up in. When he got to hell, and serve him right, it would. In our house, however, my father saved 90% of his vitriol for the Brits. He had inherited, of course, this blind prejudice from his father, who got it from old Mickey, my great-grandpa from Ireland, and my father, of course, would pass it on to me. Every year in our big old radio, the King of England would broadcast his Christmas message to the Empire. Wherever you are, serving in our wide, free Commonwealth of Nations, you will always feel at home. Though severed by long sea miles of distance, you are still in the family circle. Shut that bastard off. my father would shout, "Listen to the talk on him. He sounds like he's got a mouthful of horse balls." It was the sound of the British accent that curdled his blood. The sound spelled arrogance and snootiness, pomposity, sneakiness, cruelty, hypocrisy, and cowardice. And worse things. And anything else loathsome that you'd care to throw in. Didn't help my family harmony when my beautiful older sister began a romance with an Englishman named Beale, and later married him. And at the wedding, my father said in a stage whisper, you could hear down the block, "Look at him. He's got a neck on him like a goddamn goose."
So we have about 15 copies of the book, and I think we're holding a draw. I think Doug has that in hand. But before then, we're going to open up some questions. So if anybody would like to ask Brian anything about the essays.
Sure. I'm about the same generation as Brian. I remember the Barber family, and we were racist as well, but I'm a French Canadian. And I remember the Protestants, the Catholics, the Anglophones, the Francophones. That was racism in those days. But I remember going to a dinner at my aunt's on a Sunday afternoon, and I had missed the previous Sunday. And she said, "Where were you?" I said, "I was at my girlfriend." "Well, what did you have for dinner?" "We had lamb." "Ah, you've eaten with Protestants." French Canadians did not eat lamb.
I have a quick one. Is there a chapter that really stands out for you? Maybe one of the more meaningful ones?
Well, is this an invitation to read another one?
No, not
okay.
yet.
Oh, well. Should I?
Did you have another question?
Encore.
No. Okay. Well,
What do you think?
sure.
Read on.
I guess the third chapter you're going to read about is travel.
Well, should we do this, or
Sure.
are you mad at me?
I'm not mad. I could never be mad at you.
Okay.